You are listening to the Norton Library Podcast, where we explore classic works of literature and philosophy with the leading scholars of the Norton Library, a new series from W.W. Norton that introduces influential texts to a new generation of readers. I'm your host, Mark Chirino, with Michael Von Cannon producing. Today, we present the second of our two episodes devoted to the Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio, as we interview its translator and editor, Wayne A. Rebhorn. In part one, we discussed Boccaccio's life and background, the form and content of the Decameron, and the project of translating this masterpiece. In this second episode, we learn more about Wayne Rebhorn's relationship with this author and his famous text, how he first encountered it, the way the Decameron has been adapted, Wayne's favorite line, and so much more. Wayne A. Rebhorn is the Mildred Hayek Vodcek and John Roman Vodcek Chair in English at the University of Texas, where he teaches English, Italian, and comparative literature. His translation of Boccaccio's Decameron won the 2014 Penn Center USA's Literary Award for Translation. It is great to have him back with us today. Wayne Rebhorn, welcome back to the Norton Library Podcast.
Thank you. I'm happy to be back.
Happy to have you back and happy to continue discussing your edition of Giovanni Boccaccio's The Decameron. And maybe we can start, have the very handsome Norton Library edition in hand right now. Do you have any reaction to the design of the cover? Is there a reason that it is so designed?
That is, the third version of the Decameron. This was intended for, I think, the market was going to be like high school students, perhaps, and college students.
Yes.
But the first edition, it was a hardback, and it had two illustrations from a 15th century French translation of one of the stories. In fact, it's the first story of the fourth day, one of the tragic stories in the Decameron. And there are like three illustrations from that French translation. But then when the Decameron seemed to be gaining some traction with the public, Norton decided to issue it in paperback, and they completely redesigned the cover. This has a picture of Titian's Venus of Urbino. It's a nude. She's reclining in a reclining position. And the designers of the cover, I wish I could say it was me, but it wasn't, have her, it's just a clip from it. It's not the whole picture, but she's lying there and you can see it goes from her head to her belly button, more or less, with her breasts exposed and so on. And the big D for the Decameron kind of wraps around her. And part of it comes out of her head, and the swirl of the back of the D, the straight part of the D, is actually curved, but goes right over her right breast. So it's kind of focusing you on that. It's like, it's a bad boy cover for a bad boy writer.
Of course. Yeah. So this edition, this Norton Library edition, is sort of custardy yellow with hints of brown. It's a very striking edition. Wayne, do you remember when you first encountered Boccaccio?
Oh, yes. Vividly, as a matter of fact. I was in high school, and I was, I think, trying to acquire the kind of education that you'd have as a nice, literate middle-class person. And I'd had one of those books. I don't remember what it was. It said, here are the 100 books you have to read to be, the complete man or something, the complete person. And one of them was the Decameron. I don't have any idea why it was in there. But anyway, so I went to the local branch of the library in Philadelphia where I grew up, and I took out the book. It was the Modern Library edition from way back when. And I never read it, to be honest. I didn't. But what I remember is this, that I guess it was on either the title page or a blank page near the very beginning, someone had written in the copy of the library's copy something like, "This is a terrible, wicked, evil book," or something like this. And a librarian had pasted a piece of white paper over that. but you could still read the words. And so I'm left with a quandary. Is the librarian trying to encourage it, or is the librarian trying to cut it out? And there's no answer to that.
What better way to get a young guy to continue reading that book, right?
It's like having a sign in your bookstore saying "Banned in Boston" or something like that back in the old days. And so that was my first encounter. It wasn't much of an encounter, but it did sort of set by, give me certain expectations. And then after I started teaching down here in Texas, I worked up a course on the European Renaissance, and eventually I don't think the first go round, but by the second or third, I certainly included Boccaccio, and then he became. I gave him more time as the semesters wore on, and I realized that this was a great text, not taught, not read nearly enough, and that I was fascinated by it. I had things to say about it, so I expanded some time. He was never like a whole. I actually gave a graduate course completely of Boccaccio once years ago, but other than in my undergraduate course, I always included at least a couple of weeks, and the students loved it. They really did. And they loved it because one of the things to say about Boccaccio, as I said, his name means big mouth. This bad boy of Western literature, who is that his texts is filled with really wonderful illicit lovemaking and other things like that. And though it's a bad text in that sense, it's wicked. He doesn't use any bad words. The only word he does use that's bad in any sense at all is the word culo in Italian, which means ass or asshole. And only 2 or 3 times. He never ever never uses the big F or its equivalent in Italian. He has euphemisms for that. And the thing about euphemisms, especially if they're consciously used as Boccaccio does, it's like they're fun. It's a twofer. You get to know what the thing is it's hiding, but it's not really hiding it, so you get the pleasure of watching him transform it. One of the favorite stories is about a woman in North Africa who's heard about Christianity, doesn't know what it is. She's very beautiful, by the way. Her name is Alatiel. And she goes out into the desert looking for a hermit. And she finds a hermit. And the first one says, no, you go away, because he knows that she'd be a temptation. And the next hermit does the same. And finally she comes to one hermit whose name is Rustico, which means rustic, which means, rube. Mm-hmm. And he says, sure, you can say. And of course, he's aroused by her and so forth and so on. And next thing he knows, he's gotten himself undressed and her undressed. And she's amazed. She looks at his erection and says, what is that? And he says, that's the devil. And the devil's causing me a lot of problems and just making me miserable and so forth and so on. And he said, and then she asks, well, what's, I don't have that thing. What do I have there instead? She says, he says, that's hell. You have hell. And then he gets her, of course, to put the devil back in hell. And, you get the sort of almost voyeuristic pleasure of imagining this couple doing the deed, and the other pleasure of how wonderfully transparently disguised it is. And of course, the story has one final twist, which is marvelous. At the end, he finds he can have her as often as he wants. He finds he can't keep up with her. She's always asking him to, let's do it again. And he says, I can't do it now. We'll have to postpone it, blah, blah, blah. And so finally he sends her back to civilization or to her city. And because he can't keep up with her. So it's a wonderful, it starts out being a kind of sexist, anti-feminist thing where the woman is the victim of the man's sexual desires, too stupid to figure out what's happening. And it turns out at the end, he gets his comeuppance or come down or whatever it would be. So it's a wonderful, wonderful story.
As a translator, do you keep the euphemisms? Are you trying to maintain Boccaccio's same register, or what's your technique in that situation?
Oh, I absolutely keep the euphemisms. You've got to do that. And so unfortunately, they're not specifically Italian in the sense that you can't really translate it. Putting the devil back in hell. I told my students, I used to tell my students, once you've read that, you'll never use that phrase again. Right? Or sometimes it would be thwacking her wool or thwacking the wool, smacking the wool, which of course is, I don't have to explain that, but that's also a metaphor for sex. Or talking about, and in fact, Boccaccio himself talks about in the very conclusion to his work about how some people faulted him for this and that. One of them is that he doesn't say euphemisms, but he'll say things like mortars and pestles. You know what a mortar is? It's a long, you sort of grind stuff in, and with a long sort of phallic-like uh, pestle, which of course is pesting, is beating the whatever's in the mortar, and so he prefers that kind of thing. He talks about how friars, I guess clergy in general, but the friars, because they are celibate, have a lot of water stored up in their mill ponds. That's when you store the water in mill ponds, so the water wheel could continue to grind grain and stuff in the dry seasons. And so they've got a lot of water there, so they can really do it when they do it. And so it's one of those wonderful things that the more you go on, the more pleasure you get, both vicariously through the sexual situations and also with the witty language.
In your experience, having taught this to generations of readers, what do you find is the challenge for 21st century readers?
Well, there's one challenge. I think it would be kind of the naive challenge. Did they really do that and talk like that in those days? It's like they forget that they have been engendered by their parents, whom they can't imagine ever having sex, right? And so think about earlier generations. Somehow the world produced itself, but you think, oh, they couldn't. Did they really say that? Did they really think that? And the answer is yes, kiddos, they really did. My kids are not that naive. My students are not that naive, but still there's a bit of, wow, they did that back then? They talked like that back then? You think that all young people think they've invented things like sex. They haven't. It's been around for a very, very long time. And so one of the things is to disabuse them of the notion that, that they've invented the world, and they've invented things that have been around for a long time. The other thing is to get them to see that even in texts which will strike one as very different, not just with the bits of language I leave in from Italian, like the word messer, which means sir or mister. I keep that in the original Italian, explain it, but it's there to give them a little sense of, well, this is not our world. This is a different language, a different culture. Is that they get to see that human beings are alike and have been alike for generations, centuries, for millennia, but also because of the little linguistic difference, no, they really haven't been quite alike. We think that because everybody's always had sexual urges or what have you, or had sexual satisfaction in intercourse, that of course we're all the same. Yes, we are. And no, we're not. And that's the pleasure of doing the translation, partly, to sort of bring them so close, but keep them at a slight difference. So they always sense that we're not Boccaccio's generation. We're not living in this 14th century.
Is Boccaccio's original language easy to work with as a translator? Is there a way that we can sort of conceptualize it compared to, let's say, Dante or Petrarch?
Italian is an inflected language, which means that they could do more with participles and things because the endings tell you how that word relates to other words in a sentence. And so Boccaccio, in the narrative portions of the Decameron, which he himself is narrating, or the narrators, the 10 people who get together and tell these stories, and when they talk to one another and so forth and so on, some of it would be what we would call just conversational, but a lot of it is very formal. I mean, sentences that go on for half a page, and so forth and so on, and that's easier to do in Italian than in English because of the inflected nature of the language. But that said, that's a problem for me as a translator. That was a problem. How do you take a sentence that goes on for like 75 words with lots of subordinate clauses and turn it into English? If you did it exactly the way Boccaccio wrote it, you would create an awful version in English. So you have to break it up. And sometimes you'll have to decide, participial clauses, are they about something before, something at the same time, or whatever? So it's really, I often think of myself as a translator, as a kind of puzzle solver. How do you take this sentence, which seems puzzling to you in a foreign language, or could seem puzzling to you if you wrote it just as it is in English, and turn it into something that actually works? That was one of the real challenges of it. And I think more or less, I succeeded in doing that. Now, there are also places, especially where lower class characters talk, where it's just standard conversation. Or not standard, but it's conversation. Much easier to do. And so on. And that brings me to another point about Boccaccio. There's no one single Boccaccio style. There's the more formal stuff that he himself writes in places where the author is writing, is narrating. And then there's slightly less formal, but still very formal conversation among the 10 young men and women who are telling these stories. And then there's the stuff that like peasants and things say, which are short sentences and sometimes with euphemisms and usually not, and so on. So that it was a challenge to try and keep that a level of stylistic distinction. And Boccaccio helped me, of course, because he has already built it in terms of length, like the length of sentences. But when the 10 narrators are talking and setting up a story, they're talking in very formal prose. And I think that's when the Italians look back on Decameron and look back in the 16th century, certainly after, they saw that as the kind of defining feature of his prose.
Do the 10 narrators speak alike? Do they have distinct voices?
They do in terms of their construction of sentences, but there's a difference in that the 7 women. And remember, Boccaccio lived in a society where there were differences between men and women, and women were seen as not being public figures and confined to the home and so forth and so on. In fact, one of the things that Boccaccio says is he's writing these stories for love. The whole work is for lovelorn women who are trapped in their houses and can't get out to meet their lovers or whatever. And so women were not expected to be public figures. And not to have the kind of command of language that men in public arena would supposedly have, and yet they have it. Now, that's one of the kind of implicit revolutionary things that Boccaccio is doing, because 7 of the 10 narrators are women. The men, on the other hand, and there are 3 of them, have a distinctive role because, first of all, they have what we might call speaking names that say something. The one who ends this collection, it's the last set of stories about magnanimity and generosity, is named Panfilo, which means loving of all or all loving. The one who initiates the tragic stories of day 4 is Philostrato, which Boccaccio thought, I think incorrectly, but nevertheless was someone who's laid low by love. So of course he's going to choose to have stories like that. And Dioneo, the 3rd of the men, whose name refers to, so it's like it's equivalent of Dionysus. And he introduces the stories in the 7th day about how women play tricks on their husbands. And so, which is why the 7th, 8th, and 9th stories get the characters, the narrators into a kind of an impasse, a trouble that they are talking about human quality, intelligence, wit, cleverness, storytelling that doesn't necessarily have happy outcomes. I mean, they're happy enough, but like people almost die and things like that. And so Dioneo, of course, he's the bad boy among the bad boys, and so he tells that story. And in fact, he gets the privilege of telling the last story of every day after about day 2, and the very last story in the collection, 1010, is about the so-called patient Griselda. She became a kind of standard figure. There's even a play in English, I think, I've not read it, called The Patient Grizzle. Anyway, and she's patient because her husband, she's a peasant, she's elevated to become wife of a nobleman by him because he wants a wife that's totally compliant, I guess. And he subjects her to horrible abuse. Pretends he's killed her kids. Pretends he's being married to someone else who turns out to be her daughter, and so forth, and she endures it patiently. And at the end, he says, "You've been such a good woman, I'm going to restore everything for you." And so at the end, he is the example of magnanimity. Ha, ha, ha.
Right.
Because he restores everything to her. He's taken away. And when Dioneo finishes telling this tale, which is a send-up of the whole idea of magnanimity, he says at the end, basically, if I were Griselda, I'd go out and find myself somebody in the country and go have sex with him, after the Marquis had chucked you out. And so I think that the males have this capacity for kind of commentary on what everybody else is doing, and that's a wonderful commentary, especially because he's, as I say, the bad boy of the bad boy in the text.
Wayne, in the entire Decameron, do you have a favorite line?
I do, and I think I wrote it down here somewhere. And if I remember it correctly, it's "Bocca baciata non perde ventura, anzi rinnova come fa la luna." A mouth that's been kissed doesn't lose its good fortune, its advantage, but it renews itself like the moon, because the moon goes from a slit to a fold and back again, and so on. This line was, by the way, borrowed or not. This proverb was borrowed and reworded slightly for Verdi's last opera, Falstaff, and it becomes slightly. He wants it to, the Boito, the libretto wants it to rhyme, but it's actually the last word of the first line is not Ventuna, which is in Verdi, because it's Ventuna and Luna rhyme. It's Ventura and Luna. Ventura means like adventure. It's luck, good luck. And of course, it's a kiss. This is a story about how it's from the second day. It's about a woman who has had sex with 9 men, because she's very naive, all over the Mediterranean, from one end to the other, and finally is passed off as a proper virgin and married to someone at the very end. So you can see the sort of subversive implications of that. And that's where the Boccaccio cites the proverb, "Bocca baciata non perde ventura, anzi rinnova come fa la luna." It's a kissed mouth is always good, because it renews itself like the moon. And I think I was reading this. I was thinking about this the other day, and I said, if you think about the moon, it starts off as a sliver.
Yeah.
It's a curved sliver, becomes full, and closes down again. It opens up and closes down again. It opens up and closes down again. What am I talking about? If you're talking about at another level of interpretation, I'm talking about sex. I'm also talking about a mouth that opens and closes, it opens and closes, it opens and closes. And so that's the kind of richness inside the stories that you get. Boccaccio takes a common proverb, which seems to be sort of a standard, a celebration of love, and it's the kissed mouth always renews itself like the moon. And it has a kind of a dirty or sexual implication. And it also has something about speaking and shutting with your mouth, which of course is really what the whole collection is about. And of course, Boccaccio's name comes from the word bocca in Italian, which means mouth. And so it's a big mouth, a dirty mouth, a loud mouth. And all of that sort of stuff plays together. And that's one of the things where I think you miss a little bit if you don't know the Italian, but not too much.
Beautiful proverb. Do you have a hot take about the Decameron, something counterintuitive where you are swimming against the stream of the centuries that have been offering reactions to this work?
Sure. Well, let's put it this way. When we encounter world literature, I think there's a tendency to treat it a bit like the Bible. A big fat book with onion skin pages, because there's so much in it. And we treat it with reverence. And I think Boccaccio's text, Boccaccio's Decameron, tells you you don't do it that way. You should enjoy it in terms of its pleasures. Let me add something to that. Comedy is second rate in most people's minds. Of course, we love comedy. Look at all the sitcoms on TV, all the funny plays we see, all the movies, the rom-coms, and so on. We love comedy. But if you had one book by Shakespeare, one play by Shakespeare to take on a desert island for the rest of your life, of course, Lear or Hamlet or something like a tragedy, a great big play. Not Much Ado About Nothing or As You Like It or something like that. That's wrong. Comedy has a place, and it's dear to our hearts. Dearer than we think. But when we think, serious literature can't be serious literature if it's comedy. Of course it can be. Of course it can be. Because laughter is wonderful. It's a release. It's pleasure. It's an affirmation of pleasure rather than an acceptance of pain.
So how does that attitude manifest itself? How do you approach this where it's not sacrosanct, but you are kind of working with the text?
I think my students to see that there's something serious about the pleasure we get from a story we're imagining a couple making love together, or somebody using his clever wit to get out of a jam, and that sort of thing. There's one story, a very short story in the Sixth Day about a guy who's a cook for a nobleman, and the nobleman's going out hunting. He's hunted a crane. I don't know how they ate cranes in those days. Boggles my mind, but be that as it may. And so he's supposed to prepare that for dinner, but his girlfriend comes by and says, "Oh, that looks so good." And so she gets one of the legs of the crane. So the guy serves it to the master, and the master says, there's a problem here. There's only one leg. And the cook says, "Oh, well, that's what they have." And the master says, "No. If we're going to go take a look and see, and if it turns out that they've got two legs, you're in trouble." So they go out the next day, and he's looking. They go out to a marsh or wherever the cranes are hanging out, and a lot of them are standing on one leg, filling the other leg up. They apparently didn't do that. I don't know about crane lore, but at any rate, the cook says, "Well, look, there's just one leg." And the master says, "Oh, no, that's not true." And he goes, "Who?" And the cranes, of course, hearing the sound, freak out. They put their other legs down and they move away. And the cook thinks, he's desperate, of course. He hears the punishment about to be inflicted on him. He says, "Oh, well, if you just yelled who to the crane that I served last night, we would have seen the other leg," or something like that. And so the master's great, because the master says, "That's really funny. I love the guy," and he gets off scot-free. And that's sort of like the moral of the Decameron. If you use your wits,
Yeah.
you will often get yourself out of a real jam like that, which could involve pain, even be life-threatening.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I love about the Decameron. It tells us not that we have to endure tragedy. We have to.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that life could be awful, as in the plague or as in the pandemic, but that we can make something out of it that provides us with fun, and fun is important. Laughter is important.
With all of that in mind, over the last centuries, how has the Decameron been repurposed, presented using other means or genres or media in ways that readers might encounter?
Yeah. I think, as I said, it's something of a stealth classic, and so it has more presence in Italian literature than in European or world literature generally. And that's partly because I say there's a prejudice against comedy. Like, it's not as serious as tragedy, but I think this text and comedy in general is very serious. But at any rate, I think that there was a fairly recent series on Netflix called The Decameron, but it was a travesty of Decameron. It focused only on the 10 narrators and had them, it's very funny, but having them do sort of silly things. Part of the fun was in that, and also having all sorts of illicit sexual relations and stuff like that. That is not at all what happens in the Decameron itself. The 10 young men and women are a model of decorum. Although we know that several of the men and several of the women love one another and so forth and so on, there is no indication in the text that there's any hanky-panky going on. Not at all. And that's part of the thing. Here's these 10 very decorous young people telling stories that would embarrass your parents, if you told them to them. But again, without any bad words.
So is this the first time that we've tried to adapt it cinematically, or have people tried it before? There's
a movie done by Pier Paolo Pasolini from 1971, and it's a very good movie, but he was communist, and he sympathized with the lower classes against the middle class and things like that. And I think he does maybe 6 or 7 stories in the course of this thing, and it's framed by the first story, the story in which the worst man in the world turns himself through a phony confession into the best man. And what happens? What Pasolini does is he turns it into an indictment of the clergy, using this man because he becomes a saint. And who benefits from that? Well, of course, we all do theoretically, but it's the clergy. because they get more people to come to their church and give more in donations and so forth and so on for San Chappuletto, for Saint Chappuletto. And what he's done, of course, is he's really screwed them. It's interesting that his real name was Ceperello, which means a log or a tree trunk. Okay? And so he turned himself into Chappuletto, which sounds a bit like chapelet, which in French, which means a rosary. And so the people think he's really Chappulet, he's really a holy guy. But in fact, he's Ceperello. He's just given them the log. If you interpret that, as I hope you will.
So you would not recommend the recent Netflix series?
No, absolutely not. You can watch the Pasolini film, which is available. And it's also, by the way, 1971, full frontal nudity for men as well as women. How about that as an enticement?
I see. One more question, Wayne, and this is about your act of translating this. I wonder, I can imagine the Decameron has been translated time and time again into English. Yeah. What was your process in terms of negotiating with those earlier translations or seeking the original? How far back can you go and how pure a copy of Boccaccio's original can you encounter?
Well, I know we do have, as I said, he copied. It's funny. He met Petrarch and he decided he would be much more serious Christian after meeting Petrarch, and he disavowed his Decameron and so forth and so on. But then he copied it out in his own hand later on in his life. So we know that he had attraction to it, and that's the copy that's preserved in Berlin, with a few things missing, which the Paris version, which is not in his hand, I believe, make for us, give us. So
you're able to work with the original. Yeah, as close to the original as possible.
Yes, and that's been edited and translated. I think John Singleton, who taught at Johns Hopkins, had translated it based on the original, and you can use his translation as a reference point. Although it's a terrible, terrible translation, it tries to reproduce Italian syntax in English, and you simply can't do that.
Yeah,
you can write more complex sentences in English, but not the way the Italians might. And simple sentences as well. So I think that actually, looking back on it, there were days when I would do just one paragraph. I'd feel defeated. But the whole process was wonderful. It really was. And I also translated Machiavelli, which is a totally different kind of writer, but not as challenging as Boccaccio was, I must say.
When you translated the Decameron, did you go from beginning to end?
Pretty much, yeah. I remember I did the first 3 days, the second and third day. The second day has a lot of long, long stories because it's about people dealing with fortune and all the ups and downs of fortune, quite literally ups and downs in many senses of the word, as you can imagine. I'm teasing your imagination here too. And I finished day 3, and I think I felt a little defeated because it was taking much, much longer. In fact, it took 7 years, more or less, from beginning to end. And it was published in 2013, which was Boccaccio's 700th birthday. And I turned 70 in 2013. So 777. As I've told people, at least it wasn't 666.
No, that's absolutely perfect. Wayne Rebhorn, thank you so much for joining us on the Norton Library podcast to discuss your edition of Boccaccio's The Decameron. Thank you so much, Wayne.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
The Norton Library edition of The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio, edited by Wayne A. Rebhorn, is available now in paperback and ebook. Check out the links in the description to this episode for ordering options and more information about the Norton Library, including the full catalog of titles.